Hey guys, doing something different today. So I'm actually going to be reading from my history book, but I'll be reading that in school. I'm actually here in school, Chesapeake College. So we're on a new section right now, the American Age. Just started here. Just finished up with the atomic bomb last chapter. So yeah, the atomic bomb has happened. But yeah, we'll see how this goes. I can usually just do my studies in this room and nobody comes and bothers me. But yeah, we'll see. Might have to cut it off, I guess. So we'll see. We'll see. The American Age. As the Second World War was ending in 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, like Woodrow Wilson before him, staked his hopes for a peaceful future on a new international organization, this time called the United Nations rather than the League of Nations. On April 25, 1945, 2 weeks after Roosevelt's death and 2 weeks before the German surrender, delegates from 50 nations at war with Germany and Japan met in San Francisco to draw up the charter of the United Nations. The charter gave the UN Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The Security Council included 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, replaced by the Russian Federation in 1991, Great Britain, France, and the Republic of China, replaced by the People's Republic of China in 1971. Each permanent member could veto any proposed action by the United Nations. It quickly became evident, however, that 2 members of the Security Council, the United States and the Soviet Union, had such intense differences of opinion about international policies that the United Nations was largely impotent in dealing with the Cold War that shaped post-war politics. As a consequence, the post-war period witnessed neither war nor peace, but a constant state of tension. The United States emerged from the Second World War as the world's greatest military and economic power, and the only nation with atomic weapons. While much of Europe and Asia struggled to recover from the human misery and physical devastation of the war, including an acute shortage of working men, the United States was virtually unscathed. Its economic infrastructure intact and operating at peak efficiency. Jobs that had been scarce in the 1930s were now available for the taking. By 1955, the United States, with only 6% of the world's population, was producing half the world's goods. American capitalism became a dominant cultural force around the world too. In Europe, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere, American products, fashion, and forms of entertainment and popular culture attracted excited attention. Henry Luce, the publisher of Time and Life magazines, proclaimed that the 20th century had become the American century. Yet a deepening Cold War between the democratic and communist nations cast a cloud of concern over the post-war world. The ideological combat with the Soviet Union produced numerous foreign crises and sparked a witch hunt for communists in the United States. After 1945, Republican and Democratic presidents aggressively sought to contain the spread of communism around the world. Got some hot chocolate here. At the same time, the United States and the Soviet Union took advantage of the collapse of European overseas empires in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia to launch a ruthless competition to secure new markets, natural resources, and geopolitical influence in the so-called developing nations. This containment strategy embroiled the United States in costly wars in Korea and in Southeast Asia. A backlash against the Vietnam War, 1964 to 1973, also inflamed a youth rebellion at home in which militant young idealists not only opposed the war, but also provided much of the energy for many overdue social reforms, including racial equality, gay rights, feminism, and environmentalism. The anti-war movement destroyed Lyndon Johnson's presidency in 1968 and provoked a conservative counterattack. President Richard Nixon's paranoid reaction to his critics led to the Watergate affair and the destruction of his presidency. Through all this turmoil, however, the expanding role of the federal government that Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal programs had initiated remained essentially intact. With only a few exceptions, both Republicans and Democrats after 1945 acknowledged that the federal government must assume greater responsibility for the welfare of individuals. Even President Ronald Reagan, a sharp critic of federal social welfare programs during the 1980s, recognized the need for the government to provide a safety net for those who could not help themselves. Yet this fragile consensus on public policy and the Cold War had collapsed by the late 1980s amid stunning international developments and social changes at home. The surprising implosion of the Soviet Union in 1989 and the disintegration of European communism left the United States as the only superpower. After 45 years, U.S. foreign policy was no longer focused on a single adversary. During the early 1990s, East and West Germany reunited. Racial segregation, apartheid, in South Africa ended, and Israel and the Palestinians, long-standing foes, signed a treaty ending hostilities, at least for a while. The end of the Cold War and we all know how that goes, or how that went. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union into Russia and 14 separate nations lowered the threat of nuclear war and reduced public interest in foreign affairs. Yet numerous ethnic, nationalist, and separatist conflicts brought constant tensions and instability at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. The United States found itself drawn into political and military crises in faraway lands such as Bosnia, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, and Syria. Throughout the 1990s, the United States waged a difficult struggle against many groups engaged in organized terrorism. The challenges facing intelligence agencies in tracking the movements of foreign terrorists became tragically evident in 2001. At 8:46 on the morning of September 11, 2001, the world watched in horror as a hijacked commercial airplane slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 17 minutes later, a second hijacked plane hit the South Tower. While the catastrophe was unfolding in New York City, a third hijacked airliner crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. It's crazy. While a fourth, presumably headed for the White House or the Capitol, missed its mark when passengers assaulted the four terrorists, sending the plane out of control and crashing to the ground near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all 45 people on board. Within hours of the hijackings, officials identified the 19 hijackers as members of Al-Qaeda, Arabic for the base. The well-financed worldwide network of Islamic terrorists led by a wealthy Saudi renegade, Osama bin Laden. The new president, Republican George W. Bush, responded by declaring a war on terror with the passage of the so-called Patriot Act. Congress gave the president new authority to track down and imprison terrorists at home and abroad. The war on terror began with assaults first on terrorist bases in Afghanistan and then on Saddam Hussein's dictatorship in Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom. Yet terrorism proved to be an elusive and resilient foe, and the war in Iraq and the ensuing U.S. military occupation were much longer, more expensive, and less successful than Americans had expected. The American age. The 9/11 terrorist attacks generated a wave of patriotism in the United States, but divisive issues remained. A huge federal debt, risking annual budget deficits, rising annual budget deficits, soaring healthcare costs threatened to bankrupt an America that was becoming top-heavy with retirees as the baby boom generation born during and after the Second World War entered its 60s. The graying of America had profound social and political implications. It made the tone of political debate more conservative because older people tend to be more conservative, and exerted increasing stress on healthcare costs, nursing home facilities, and the Social Security system. The surprising victory of Barack Obama in the 2008 presidential election, not too surprising. It's not really that surprising. I don't know how that was surprising. Yeah, that's not really surprising. Resulted from people embracing his theme of hope and change. Of course, right? The candidate of hope, the savior, the fake savior. He pledged to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, unite a divided nation, create a healthcare system directed at the uninsured, and provide jobs to the growing numbers of unemployed. As the first African American president, Obama symbolized the societal changes transforming national life in the 21st century. Yet, I guess you could say that. Yet, no sooner was Obama inaugurated than he inherited the worst economic slowdown since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Oh, he inherited it, right? Yeah, okay. What a joke. What came to be called the Great Recession dominated the Obama presidency, and indeed much of American life, beginning with a prolonged sense of uncertainty and insecurity. For all its economic power and military might, the United States in the 21st century has not eliminated the threat of terrorism or unlocked the mystery of sustaining prosperity in an era of globalization. That many Americans did not share in the economic recovery and were frustrated by the continuing influx of immigrants, especially Mexicans and Central Americans, and the inability of the politicians in Washington, D.C. to work together to solve problems helps explain the remarkable presidential candidacy of brash real estate developer Donald Trump. As a self-described disruptive political force, he seized control of the 2016 presidential campaign by turning conventional assumptions of America's role abroad and its priorities at home topsy-turvy. Interesting statement there. Don't know if I believe it or understand it, or agree with it, actually. Donald Trump lived up to his pledge to be a disruptive president. Okay, here we go. He discarded traditional norms of behavior with Congress and the media, and he used executive authority to bypass a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. He greatly restricted the admission of immigrants and refugees, lowered taxes, thank heavens, appointed conservative justices to the Supreme Court, hallelujah, and lower courts, and forged friendships with foreign dictators from Russia's Vladimir Putin to North Korea's Kim Jong-un, as any great American leader would do. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Duh. During Trump's presidency, a series of incidents in which police in various cities killed unarmed blacks set off massive protests. Police in various cities killed unarmed blacks. Okay, so that's a horrible way of stating that. Ridiculous. This is a horrible sentence right here. set off massive protest marches across the nation and the world. The demonstrations against police brutality reinvigorated the Black Lives Matter BLM movement and triggered counter-protests by white supremacists. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. That President Trump expressed mixed messages about the legitimacy of white nationalist groups such as the Proud Boys only made a volatile situation more incendiary. Actually, things were politicized. Early in 2020, President Trump and his administration were slow to respond to the onset of the coronavirus. What do you say? They were slow to respond? No, they weren't. They were actually very proactive and quick to respond. I can't believe they're saying this here. This is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. They were not slow to respond. They were quick. They were quick and they got criticized for it. So give me a break. Yeah. They were slow to respond. No, they weren't. To the corona pandemic that swept across the world in 2020. Within just a few months, not to read like an idiot because that's what we know is writing this right now. Within just a few months, the United States had the highest number of cases and the highest death toll in the world, in large part because President Trump decided it was more important to reopen the U.S. economy than to follow the advice of public health officials in fighting the spread of the virus. Oh, wow. So they're blaming Trump for that. Wow, what a joke. What an absolute joke. What a joke. Medical experts. Yeah, you're kidding me right here. This is absolute trash. Medical experts urged the president and governors to slow the spread of the contagion by closing schools, colleges, and businesses, banning spectator sports and all large gatherings, and requiring the universal wearing of face masks, along with the practice of social distancing, whereby people were asked to stay 6 feet apart from one another. Yeah, it was a horrible time of stupidity and frustration and ignorance. More than anything, these two events, the surging coronavirus pandemic and the protests against police brutality, explain why Democrat Joe Biden was able to defeat Donald Trump's bid for a second term in 2020. Doesn't explain anything. Biden won by the fiercely contested election and immediately set about accelerating the distribution. Oh my gosh, here they go, glorifying Biden. Set about accelerating the distribution of vaccines to immunize Americans. Yeah, you're going to give that to Biden. Actually, Trump did that against the coronavirus and pushing through Congress a massive economic stimulus bill intended to revive the sluggish economy. What an absolute joke. I can't believe you guys. This is very disappointing. This whole entire time, I have actually liked David Emery Shine, even though he's now confirmed an idiot. But, of course he's a liberal. Of course he is. Of course he is. I pretend that didn't happen because I'm going to try to enjoy the rest of this book. It is history, and I do enjoy reading history, as anyone and everyone should. Anyway, let's see here. Okay, we're starting a new chapter, The Cold War and a Fair Deal. 1945, 1952. This is what my assigned reading is. And the picture is the kids, ducking in their classrooms. Duck and cover. A duck and cover air raid drill in 1951 that was commonplace in schools during the Cold War. That's not even a complete sentence. Of course, David Emery Shine. The drills began in 1949 when the Soviet Union set off its first nuclear weapon. Pictured here are American schoolchildren practicing how to respond to a nuclear attack in February 1951. No sooner did the Second World War end than a prolonged Cold War began between East and West. The awkward wartime alliance between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union collapsed during the spring and summer of 1945. With the elimination of Nazism, their common enemy, the two strongest nations to emerge from the war became intense ideological rivals who could not bridge their differences over the basic issues of human rights, individual human rights, whatever human rights are, human rights, individual liberties, democratic elections, and religious freedom. Whatever those terms are. Those are terms, but what do they actually mean, right? Mutual suspicion and race to gain influence over the non-aligned nations of the world in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Central and South America further distanced the two former allies. The defeat of Japan and Germany had created power vacuums in Europe and Asia that sucked the Soviet Union and the United States into an unrelenting war of words fed by clashing strategic interests and political ideologies. The post-war era also saw an eruption of anti-colonial liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that would soon strip Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States of their global empires. Interesting. The Philippines, for example, gained its independence from America in 1946. The next year, Great Britain withdrew from Hindu-dominated India after carving out two new Islamic nations, Pakistan and Bangladesh, originally called East Pakistan. The emergence of Communist China, the People's Republic. Yeah, what a deceptive name. The People's Republic sounds so innocent, right? Yeah, no, they're communists. In 1949, further complicated global politics and the dynamics of the Cold War. The post-war world was thus an unstable one in which international tensions shaped domestic politics as well as foreign relations. The advent of atomic weapons was both a blessing and a curse. Both weapons of mass destruction made the very idea of warfare unthinkably horrific, which in turn made national leaders more cautious to avoid letting disputes get out of hand. Sorry, I just missed that. Such weapons of mass destruction made the very idea of warfare unthinkably horrific, which in turn made national leaders more cautious to avoid letting disputes get out of hand. Yet even the mere possibility of a nuclear holocaust cast a cloud of anxiety over the post-war era. So true. Thanks for watching, you guys. Thanks for listening. Thanks for getting learnt with me. Get learnt, boy. I've got about 42 minutes before class starts. Yeah, they're about. Truman and the Cold War. Might have to move to another class. We'll see what happens if people come in here. Truman and the Cold War. Very interesting. Right after World War II. In April 1945, less than 3 months after Harry S. Truman had begun his new role as vice president, Eleanor Roosevelt calmly informed him, "Harry, the president is dead." Okay. It's always an interesting thing to hear, isn't it? Harry, the president is dead. Oh no, it's so horrible. When Truman asked how he could help her, the First Lady replied, "Is there anything we can do for you?" Because it's up to you now, buddy. For you are the one in trouble now. Oh shoot, you in trouble now, boy. Michigan's Arthur Vandenberg, a leading Republican senator, noted in his diary after learning of Roosevelt's death, "The gravest question mark in every American heart is about Truman. Can he swing the job?" He answered his own question, "I believe he can." Okay, we're talking in third person now. Born in 1884 in western Missouri. 1884, man. He's old now, he's like 60 when he got elected or whatever, or when he became president. Truman grew up in Independence near Truman. That reminds me of the, okay, I'm done getting distracted. Truman grew up in Independence near Kansas City. During the First World War, he served in France as captain of an artillery battery. After the war, he and a partner started a clothing business, but it failed and left him in debt for 20 years. Dang. Truman, the only 20th century president who did not attend college, then entered politics as a Democrat. In 1934, Missouri voters sent him to the U.S. Senate. There was nothing extraordinary about Truman except his integrity, decisiveness, and courage. Well, that's great. Neither charming nor brilliant, he was impulsive and quick to take offense at critics. All right. Probably because he's still insecure about his business failing. Just kidding. That's deep and probably true. Maybe true. Truman was a poor public speaker, devoid of eloquence and charisma. He was so nearsighted that he never took his eyes off his text when giving a speech. When informed that Roosevelt had chosen him as his running mate in 1944, Truman gasped, "Oh, beep!" That's what it says here. On his first full day as president, that's literally what the quote that they said, "Oh, he had a similar reaction. Boys, oh my gosh." That's his reaction. That was his reaction. He had the first full day of president, he had a similar reaction. "Boys, if you ever pray for me now." That's what he said. He told reporters, "I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. Okay, well, get over it, buddy. You're president now. Suck it up and deal with it." Although Washington politicos had low expectations for the new president, Truman did better than anyone expected. He rose above his limitations and never pretended to be something he was not. Wow, this is very pro-Truman. During a visit to America in 1952, British leader Winston Churchill confessed to Truman that initially he had held him in very low regard. "I loathed your taking the place of Franklin Roosevelt. I misjudged you badly. Since that time, you, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization." Oh, snap. Don't let it go to your head, Harry. What Churchill saw in Truman was an ordinary man placed in an extraordinary position, who succeeded because of his simple faith in the common sense wisdom of the people. Okay, that's why he succeeded? Okay, well, I guess so. Now we're getting into the Cold War. Origins of the Cold War. Historians have long debated the unanswerable question: was the United States or the Soviet Union more responsible for starting the Cold War? First, I want to share something with you guys. I'm going to make this video about 45 minutes long. That's when I'll stop, because 45 minutes is the adequate time to study before your brain starts going, "Oh, why are we still studying? I'm tapped out." So I'm going to make this video 45 minutes long. You already know it if you're watching it, because you can tell. But anyway, that is a healthy period of time to study. Anything longer than 45 minutes without taking a break is not a good idea. So that's what we're going to do. Just letting you know. Origins of the Cold War. Historians have long, unless something interrupts us, historians have long debated the unanswerable question: was the United States or the Soviet Union more responsible for starting the Cold War? The conventional view argues that the Soviets, led by Joseph Stalin, set out to dominate the globe after 1945, and the United States had no choice but to defend democratic capitalist values. Historians critical of this explanation insist that the United States unnecessarily antagonized the Soviet Union. Instead of continuing Franklin Roosevelt's collaborative efforts with the Soviets, Truman pursued a confrontational foreign policy that focused on stopping the spread of communism, a policy that only aggravated tensions. Okay? For example, the United States in 1947 and 1948, when the Roswell UFO crash happened, 1947, secretly intervened in elections in France and Italy to ensure that communist candidates were defeated. Oh wow, they secretly interfered? Wow, the United States secretly interfered in France and Italy to ensure that communist candidates were defeated. Hey, you know, I don't think that's the best idea, but communism sucks. American agents gave bags of money to anti-communist candidates, provided campaign advisors, and publicly threatened to cut off aid to the governments if communists were elected. Oh, shoot. Intimidation, payoff money. In retrospect, the onset of the Cold War seems to have been an unavoidable result of the ideological competition between democratic capitalism and totalitarian communism, and their opposing views of what the post-war world should become. America's commitment to the free enterprise capitalism, political self-determination, and religious freedom conflicted with the Soviet Union's preference for controlling its neighbors, ideological conformity, and prohibiting religious practices. Son of a gun. I was thinking about something while I was reading that. Now I need to read it again. In retrospect, the onset of the Cold War seems to have been an unavoidable result of the ideological competition between democratic capitalism and totalitarian communism, and their opposing views of what the post-war world should become. America's commitment to free enterprise capitalism, political self-determination, and religious freedom conflicted with the Soviet Union's preference for controlling its neighbors, ideological conformity, and prohibiting religious practices. Insecurity drove much of Soviet behavior. Russia, after all, had been invaded by Germany twice in the first half of the 20th century, and some 23 million people died as a result. Soviet leaders were determined to dominate nations on their borders and in their region, just as the United States had been doing for decades in Central and South America. Makes sense. The people of the peoples of Eastern Europe were caught in the middle, and the Cold War soon came to dominate global politics. It was not simply a traditional contest between rival great powers. It was also a global war of ideas, worldviews, and political systems. President George H.W. Bush would later call the Cold War a struggle for the soul of mankind. Americans are still living in its shadow. Interesting point. Yeah. Conflicts with the Soviets. Okay, now we're getting some conflicts. Okay, interesting. The wartime military alliance against Nazism disintegrated after 1945 as the Soviet Union violated the promises it had made at the Yalta Conference. Instead of allowing the people living in Eastern European nations, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, to vote in democratic elections to choose their governments, the Soviets imposed military control and a communist political system on the nations of Eastern Europe that it had liberated from Nazi control. On May 12, 1945, 4 days after victory in Europe, Winston Churchill asked Harry Truman, "What is to happen about Eastern Europe? An iron curtain is drawn down upon the Russian front. We do not know what is going on behind it." Interesting. Churchill and Truman wanted to lift the Iron Curtain and help those nations develop democratic governments. Events during the second half of 1945, however, dashed those expectations. Stuff's about to happen, you guys. Beginning in the spring of 1945 and continuing for the next 2 years, the Soviet Union systematically imprisoned half the European continent and installed puppet governments across Central and Eastern Europe. The Soviets eliminated all political parties except the Communists, created secret police forces, took control of intellectual and cultural life, including the mass media, and organized a process of ethnic cleansing whereby whole populations, 12 million Germans, as well as Poles and Hungarians, were relocated, usually to West Germany or to prisons. Anyone who opposed the Soviet-installed regimes was exiled, silenced, imprisoned, or executed. Dang. Crazy stuff happening. Dang. Stalin's promise at the Yalta Conference to allow open elections in the nations controlled by Soviet armies had turned out to be a lie. In a fit of candor, he admitted that a freely elected government in any of these countries would be anti-Soviet, and that we cannot allow. U.S. Secretary of State James F. Burns tried to use America's monopoly on the atomic bomb to pressure the Soviets. In April 1945, he suggested to President Truman that nuclear weapons might well put us in position to dictate our own terms with the Soviets at the end of the war. The Soviets, however, paid little attention, in part because their spies had kept them informed of what U.S. scientists had been doing, and in part because they were developing their own atomic bombs. In April 1945, a few days before the opening of the conference to organize the United Nations, Truman met with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Truman directed Molotov to tell Stalin that the United States expected the Soviet leader to live up to his agreements. "I have never been talked to like that in my life," Molotov angrily replied. "Carry out your agreements," Truman snapped, "and you won't get talked to like that." Wow. That July, when Truman met Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, he wrote that he had never seen such pig-headed people as are the Russians. He later acknowledged that they broke their promises as soon as the unconscionable Russian dictator Stalin returned to Moscow. Truman added with a note of embarrassment, "And I liked the little son of a beep." The containment policy, okay? This seems to be fairly interesting. By the beginning of 1947, relations with the Soviet Union had grown ice cold. We're running on 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes left, so finishing up with this session. In February 1946, Stalin had proclaimed the superiority of the Soviet communist system of government and declared that peace with the United States was impossible under the present capitalist development of the world economy. Stalin's provocative statement led the State Department to ask for an analysis of Soviet communism from George Frost Kennan, the best informed expert on the Soviet Union, who was then working in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Wow. Kennan responded on February 22nd, 1946, with a famous 8,000-word long telegram in which he described the roots of Russian history, the pillars of Soviet policy, Stalin's neurotic view of world affairs, and Russia's historic determination to protect its western border with Europe. Kennan explained that the Soviet Union was founded on a rigid ideology, Marxism-Leninism, that saw a fundamental conflict between the communist and capitalist nations. Stalin and other Soviet leaders, he added, could not imagine permanent, peaceful coexistence with capitalist nations. The Soviet goal was to build military strength while promoting tensions between the capitalist democracies and subverting their stability by all possible means. It's a picture here of George F. Kennan, a specialist in the history and values of the Soviet Union. Diplomat George Kennan developed the rationale for the containment strategy at the heart of the Truman document, the Truman Doctrine. This guy created the containment policy. The best way for the United States to deal with such an ideological foe, Kennan advised, was not military confrontation. Instead, he called for patient, persistent, and firm strategic efforts to contain Soviet expansionism over the long term without resorting to war. Creating such unalterable counterforce, he predicted, would eventually cause either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. Because communism, in Kennan's view, was an unstable system, which it is, that would eventually collapse if Americans were patient and helped post-war Europe rebuild its economies. Yeah. In Kennan's view, communism was an unstable system that would eventually collapse if Americans were patient and helped post-war Europe rebuild its economies. Okay. New Secretary of State George C. Marshall, the distinguished commander of the U.S. Armed Forces during the war, was so impressed by Kennan's analysis that he put him in charge of the State Department Policy Planning Office. No other diplomat at the time forecast so accurately what would happen to the Soviet Union some 40 years later. Wow. We got 5 minutes left. In its broadest dimensions, Kennan's call for the firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies echoed the outlook of Truman and his advisors and would guide U.S. foreign policy for decades. Kennan's careful analysis, however, was vague on several key issues. How exactly were the United States and its allies to contain the Soviet Union's expansionist tendencies? How should the United States respond to specific acts of Soviet aggression around the world? Kennan was an analyst, not a policymaker. He left the task containing communism to President Truman and his advisors, most of whom, unlike Kennan, viewed containment as a military doctrine rather than a political strategy. As Truman insisted, unless Russia is faced with an iron fist and strong language, another war is in the making. In his view, Stalin and the Soviets only understood one language, the language of military power. I'm tired of babying the Soviets. In 1946, civil war broke out in Greece between the monarchy backed by the British and a communist-led insurgency supported by the Soviets. War broke out in Greece. On February 21st, 1947, the British informed the U.S. government that they could no longer provide economic and military aid to Greece and would withdraw their 40,000 troops in 5 weeks. Truman quickly conferred with congressional leaders, one of them, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a powerful Republican from Michigan, warned the president that he would need to scare the heck out of the American people. Hell, he says, about the menace of communism to gain public support for any new aid program. The Truman Doctrine. See, we might be able to finish this, but we'll see. On March 12, 1947, President Truman responded to the crisis in the eastern Mediterranean by asking Congress to provide $400 million for economic and military assistance to Greece and Turkey. More important, the president announced what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. Because the communist challenge was worldwide, he declared, it had to be confronted everywhere around the globe. Like a row of dominoes, Truman predicted, the fall of Greece to communism would spread to the other nations of the Middle East, then to Western Europe. To prevent such catastrophe, he said, the United States must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. In this single sentence, Truman established the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for the next 40 years. Single sentence that says the United States must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Very interesting. In his view, shared by later presidents, the assumptions of the domino theory made an aggressive containment strategy against communism a necessity. Truman's speech generated widespread public support. The New York Times said that his message was clear. The epoch of isolation is ended. It is being replaced by an epoch of American responsibility. Epic or epoch? I don't know. Either one. At the State Department, Secretary Marshall announced that we are now concerned with the peace of the entire world. Still, the Secretary of State and others privately feared that the flamboyant anti-communism in Truman's speech was unnecessarily provocative. Marshall believed that the president was overstating the Soviet threat. Others expressed concern about the scope and vagueness of the Truman Doctrine. George Kennan cringed at the president's grandiose commitment to contain communism everywhere. In Kennan's view, Truman's militarized view of the Cold War was a foolish crusade that knew no limits. Such efforts needed to be selective rather than universal, political and economic rather than military in nature. For all its power, he noted, the United States could not intervene in every hot spot around the world. Kennan saw no need to provide military aid to Turkey where no communist threat existed. And he preferred that economic assistance, not weapons, be provided to Greece. In his view, the Soviet threat was primarily political, not military in nature. Truman and his advisors rejected such concerns. In 1947, Congress approved the president's request for aid to Greece and neighboring Turkey. The Truman Doctrine marked the beginning of a contest that the former presidential advisor Bernard Baruch named in a 1947 speech to the legislature of South Carolina. Let us not be deceived. Today we are in the midst of a Cold War. Okay. Thanks for watching, you guys.